Hi, welcome to our episode today, all about how to do fix differently. So this is one of the very first episodes that we've done in this series, and what I wanted to do right at the beginning is to set the scene for the whole series, really. I wanted to talk about some of the items we think are solved by and large in the industry, where lots of people have gone down this path before and they found a good solution, and things where we see different firms struggling from time to time doing various different things. So these are the things I like to call to improve. And why do I want to talk about this right now? Well, because a lot of people say to me, well, look, Chris, everybody does fix. Everybody knows how to do it. We can all do it. We can all just about muddle by. But when it's all about thinking about how to do fix differently, it's not necessarily just slavishly copying exactly what everybody else has done. It's about learning how you can improve and go above and beyond and do something better than your competitors, perhaps, or just streamline your operations to make sure that you can do more with less than you have today. So let's start thinking about which things are solved and which things are still to improve. First thing in the solved bucket, fix engines. Everybody has a fix engine. There's lots of them to choose from. You could have a commercial one. You could have an open source one. There's lots of things like QuickFix, Fix8 out of Australia. These are really good fix engines. They're certainly production ready. They've been battle tested. That's pretty much solved. There's lots of options to go for. The thing that everybody struggles with, though, is how do you move from one fix engine to another? How do you take all of those legacy configurations and setups that you have for one particular customer and move it to a different one? And what you end up with there is a series of lock-in problems, vendor lock-in problems. So you end up being blocked from moving from one particular commercial vendor perhaps to an open source vendor because of all of these differences. So projects and tools to allow you to do easy migration of fix engines, that's where everybody needs to improve. Second thing to think about in terms of what's been solved, well, there's the fix standards themselves. They're very mature. Most people have centered around fix 4.2, fix 4.4. Some people have moved on to fix 5.0. By and large, the idea of standards themselves, the list of messages, the workflows, the enumerations, these things are pretty much solved. And everybody can kind of speak fix-ish, as it were. Everybody goes above and beyond that, and that's really the area that's still to be improved, is how do you capture all of the differences? My specific fix needs that are unique to my API, and nobody else really uses those. Perhaps I've created some bespoke enumerations or some bespoke fields. Perhaps these things are echoed back and forth in input and output messages. How do you capture all of those in a way that people actually want to read and want to improve? And a lot of that's all to do with documentation and specifications. So talking about specifications, the standard way that most people document these things today is Word. Every single fixed document that you typically look at looks almost identical, mostly because they've been copied. If everybody's realistic about it, you've just copied somebody else's and used that as your framework. So that's kind of been solved. The idea that there is a document, it describes my API, that's kind of been solved. The thing that's still to be improved, though, and the area of a lot of work right now in the fixed trading community elsewhere, is the idea of machine-readable documentation. So Word is great for a human to read, but we're all very busy. People have got other things to be doing. And frankly, if I'm describing an API, quite a complex API, just in words, then the probability is that I'm going to say something that you might not understand, or perhaps English isn't your first language, or something else like that, right? So there's a scope for misinterpretation in some of these Word documents that the fixed trading community is trying to remove with the idea of machine-readable documentation. So this is very precise XMLs, JSON documents, some sort of machine-readable document that a receiving application can just take, drop into their processes and systems, and they can suddenly start talking to that API. So that's an area of big focus and a big area of improvement. Another area of change in the documentation space is actually customer-specific documentation. So one of the things that banks tend to do quite a lot of is override their API for particular customers or vendors. It's perfectly reasonable, very good customer service quality to have. A customer can't actually send in a particular enumeration or a particular field in the way that you need it, and therefore the bank just internalizes that transformation and says, I'll do it for you. It's great for maintaining a level of backwards compatibility. The problem with that, though, is over time, the amount of technical debt that you have just grows and grows and grows. And you lose track of exactly what was agreed with the customer, why it was agreed with the customer. if perhaps the customer can now send you that because they've done some upgrades on their side, you lose track of these things. And so there's a whole area to be improved here about maintaining and tracking customer specific API overrides. And we'll return to this later on in the series because it's something that's very close to my heart. Okay, so we've got our engine, we've got our standards, we've got some documentation. The next thing that we need to do is have customers connect to it. So normally this is a certification problem. Now, certification kind of falls into two different categories. There is the nuts and bolts of doing certification, which means looking at log files, validating that somebody has actually sent in what they said that they're going to send in, and making sure that the project itself runs smoothly. Now, the project is actually much bigger than just validating log files. It's about things like opening firewalls and making sure that the legal and compliance sections have all been completed, or perhaps trading limits have been established, they've been set up in post-trade systems. There's a whole raft of different things that go into an onboarding project, not just looking at fix logs. Now, what I'm going to say is that these things are typically solved. The idea of certification, how to run a certification, and how to do project tracking, those things are solved, but today they tend to be solved by a series of what I like to call sticky tape and plaster solutions. So people might be doing certification processes by perhaps writing it up in Confluence that nobody really seems to read, or doing project tracking in something like Jira, perhaps, if that's what you have, or an Excel sheet if you haven't quite reached that level of maturity yet in your project tracking process. The areas that need to be improved here, and I see that there's large scope for improvement here, is in automation of these processes, automation and reporting, in fact. So, for example, taking a project tracking process, Jira is a perfectly good project tracker. Lots of people use it for their software development. That's absolutely fine. What Jira doesn't do particularly well is automate any of those tasks. So for example, if you want to send out a pre-templated email to a customer to tell them which port and IP to target and what sender comp ID to send and their fixed messages, it's just not possible in Jira. And that's the level of automation that you should ultimately be striving for, to try to make sure that you're using your internal resources as efficiently as you possibly can. So certification, the logistics of certification, the project tracking that goes along with it. Yeah, you can get by today with various different mechanisms, but there's this whole raft of things that you can do in there to improve your overall efficiency, make it smoother and faster for people to actually come on board for you. Okay, so we've got an engine, we've got some standards, we've got some documentation, we've got certification. Now we need to think about QA. So this is internal testing of your API. So there are lots of opportunities for how to do QA out there. A lot of people use some sort of combination of automated testing using something like Verifix, which is a very well-established QA test runner, and a combination of manual testing. The problem with that setup today is that, first of all, Verifix is actually quite an expensive piece of software. Just about anybody will tell you that. I don't think I'm being unfair to Activity to suggest that that's the case. But also there are lots of problems in terms of testing internal UIs, for example. So you really need something that will help you automate some of those manual tests where you're perhaps sending in a fixed message and then responding to it through some sort of UI, be that an administrative UI or an OMS or something like that. The other big area for improvement in the QA process is actually test creation. And we see this time and time again. There are test runners like Verifix that will actually automate the submission of fixed messages for you. That's absolutely fine. The creation of those tests in the first place is still largely a manual job, and nobody really has a lot of time for that. Every time that there's an upgrade, there's more and more of these tests to write, first of all, and there's also a whole load of tests that will probably break for each one of those changes. And so there's this constant problem of maintaining and upgrading your QA test cycles. And so that's an area of focus as well. Things like the machine-readable documentation should hopefully play into that area and allow you to automate the creation of some of those test cases over time. Next one, I've talked a lot about things that touch on logs. Certification touches on logs and QA touches on logs. And so one of the areas that has been solved today is log storage. So this might be production logs or UAT logs. There are lots and lots of things out there. Some people use Splunk. Some people start to use Elasticsearch. I've heard a few people use MongoDB, but not very many. Typically, it tends to be Splunk or Elasticsearch nowadays. they're great at actually just storing logs. What they don't particularly do is they don't help you understand your logs, right? So that's where log parsers come in. So parsers typically take a particular fixed message, they break it up, and they start to decode some of the tags and the value meanings inside of that message. Some of them go a little bit further than that and start to indicate problems with the message itself. So perhaps this is an unknown tag or an unknown enumeration, or let's say, you told me this repeating group was going to appear 3 times, but only it's appeared twice. Things like that. So that's the job of a log parser. Those types of tools are not typically embedded inside of Splunk, and they're not typically embedded inside of Elasticsearch. These are things that you would normally need to build yourself, and very few people actually have the time for that. And it's certainly not the unique selling point of a lot of banks and exchanges to build that sort of technology inside. There are some tools to help you. There are log parsers out there. This tends to be something that a lot of hobbyists like to build in their spare time, I've found. There's a number of online log parsers. There's one from FixSpec as well, which do various different levels of parsing log files and validating log files. One of the typical gotchas, though, in these log parsers is that in order to isolate themselves from API changes, they typically parse against the standards again. So if you have a custom field or a custom enumeration or a custom message even, then these log parsers typically don't pick it up very well. They typically don't tell you exactly what you should and shouldn't do. And that's important because as you get up to some of the higher versions of the fixed standards, these things really are huge, and they're trying to cover an awful lot of possible business flows, possible business functionality that your API probably doesn't support. And so the area of improvement here is all about parsing. It's all about making it specific to your API and working out exactly what's going on. Now that could be your API, your standard API, or it could be about customer-specific APIs as well. And on top of that, the idea of business intelligence. So Elasticsearch, Splunk, these are really designed for querying against logs. But actually, when you're starting to think about fixed logs, you should really be going down into querying and parsing validated and correctly enumerated log files, which is much harder than you might think to do. It's also important to use business intelligence from these logs to actually tell you what's going on in your environment. So, for example, if you have, let's say, 5 or 6 different algos that you're offering to customers, well, I might want to understand which customers are using which one of those algos, how frequently are they using it. Perhaps there's a customer that I would like to use it, who's promised that they're going to use it, but now I want to understand whether they are actually using that thing in production or not. So there's a whole rich seam of business intelligence that you can get out of these logs that today most people would end up having to build themselves. It's an area of good improvement for the future. One more, after all of these, you've got your engines, you've got your documentation, you've got certified people, you've got QA, you've got your logs sorted. Final one is people. So there's a lot of fix experts out in the industry. Those who are in major cities like London and New York typically have a premium in their salaries because this is such a niche market. And it's the sort of thing where you really do need to kind of see it and experience it for a number of years so that you get your overall experience level up. But there's also a load of people in lower cost locations, offshore locations, India, the Philippines, China, Russia, places like that, who have a lot of good experience with fix. So one of the things that is actually out there today and has been kind of in the solve bucket for a while is training. But the type of training that's solved today tends to be the nuts and bolts of fix, to tell you what is a fixed message, what are the basic types of messages that you might see, some fields and common enumerations that you might see in a typical log file. The one thing that is not really out there today, but should probably be out there in the future, in our opinion, is the idea of business consulting and business processes. So how does somebody go beyond the nuts and bolts of fix and actually build an API from scratch? How do they design it properly? By that, I don't mean just copying it from one place to another, but actually, what does my certification process look like? What's that end-to-end interaction with the customer? How do I make that as seamless as possible? How do I make that as fast as possible? Typically, that tends to be the realm of expensive consultants today who used to do the job of fixed onboarding. We think that there's probably a scope in there for some level of training as well. So that's it. It's a very quick overview of the fixed world as we see it. These are topics that we're going to return to again and again in this series and start to explore some of the areas of improvement and some of the places that we think people can improve and how they can improve. If I were to summarize all of these things up in a simple sentence, it would be this. Today, there's a lot of stuff out there that allow you to do fixed onboarding if you want to. And it's done in the same old fix way of doing things. Typically, it's a patchwork of tools and processes that people just have to hand. Maybe it's an Excel sheet here or a Confluence page there or a Word document there. None of it is particularly well glued together. None of it's particularly integrated. The future that we see, and this is where we label it do fix differently, is a far more integrated world where you get rid of all this patchwork and you make all of your processes and all of your tools work together in a more seamless way. And that's exactly what we're going to aim to explore later on in this series. So I hope you will join us in future episodes where we'll start to dig into some of these areas of improvement. Hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully you got some interesting tips. Please do leave us a comment and let us know what you'd like us to explore in particular, whether you got value out of this. Hit subscribe so that you don't miss out on any future episodes that we present.